The year was 2347, and humanity had finally earned its place among the stars after centuries of reaching outward from their small blue planet. The children of Earth had built colonies across 12 star systems and had been welcomed into the Galactic Concord, an alliance of 47 spacefaring species that had kept peace for over 10,000 years. Admiral Kevin Price stood on the bridge of the Earth vessel Defiance and watched the holographic display flicker with incoming distress signals that made his heart sink. The Velthary swarm had emerged from the edge of the galaxy, and they were consuming everything in their path. These creatures were like nothing humanity had ever seen before. Biomechanical locusts that stripped entire worlds bare and left nothing but dead rock behind them. They had already devoured 3 frontier systems belonging to the Corvin. One of humanity's closest friends among the alien races, Lieutenant Lara Bennett, looked up from her station with fear in her eyes and said that the Corvin were begging for help and that the Concord had refused to send anyone. Kevin felt his hands tighten into fists as he remembered the summit he had attended just 3 days ago. He had stood before representatives of dozens of species and pleaded with them to act before it was too late. The Zurith had claimed it was not their problem because the swarm was far from their borders. Palaxians had argued that getting involved would upset the balance of power in the region. Dovani, ancient beings who had seen empires rise and fall, had simply voted to abstain, as they always did when hard choices needed to be made. 7 had watched in disbelief as species after species chose to look away while millions died. He ordered Lavra to get him Counselor Margaret Gray on a secure channel. Moments later, the tired face of Earth's representative to the Concord appeared on screen, and she already knew why he was calling. Margaret told him she had spent the last 3 days begging every species with a fleet to send help, and the answer was always the same. Nobody would move to save the Kovankovan. Said that millions of innocent people were dying and that the swarm would not stop with just one species. Margaret nodded sadly and explained that the Concord believed the swarm would run out of food before reaching the core systems. They were willing to sacrifice the outer territories and everyone living there just to avoid taking any risk. Something cold and hard settled in Kevin's chest as he realized what he had to do. He told Margaret that if the galaxy would not help, then humanity would do it alone. She stared at him through the screen and reminded him that Earth's fleet was tiny compared to the swarm if he attacked them with so few ships. He would be sending human men and women to their deaths for nothing. Kevin looked out the viewport at the stars that humanity had dreamed about for so long. He said that he would rather die fighting for what was right than live, knowing he had watched innocent people burn while doing nothing. The transmission ended, and Kevin turned to face his bridge crew. They were young, most of them born on colony worlds that had never known war. They had joined the fleet dreaming of exploration and discovery, not battle and death. Now they stared at him with wide eyes full of fear, but beneath that fear, he could see something else. Burning. It was resolve. Kevin told them they had all heard what happened and that the Concord had abandoned their friends. He said he was not going to order anyone to follow him into this fight because what he planned to do broke every rule and treaty humanity had signed. If they did this, they would be alone, and many of them would probably not come back. Silence filled the bridge for a long moment. Then Laura stood up from her station and said her grandmother used to tell her stories about Earth from long ago back. Then humans were alone in the universe with no one to help them but each other. Her grandmother said that was what made them human. Not their technology or their intelligence, but their refusal to abandon each other when times got hard. Laura saluted and said she was with the Admiral. One by one, the others stood as well. Communications Officer Danny Park rose from his chair. Helmsman Christina Reyes got to her feet. Tactical Officer Marcus Cole stood and squared his shoulders. Every single person on the bridge rose to stand with their Admiral. Kevin felt his throat tighten with emotion as he looked at these brave young people who were willing to die for strangers. He told them to set course for the Corvin border at maximum speed and said they would show the galaxy what humanity was made of. The Defiance turned its nose toward the darkness and its engines roared to life behind it. Every human vessel in the sector began to fall into formation. Without being asked, 37 ships against an enemy that numbered in the thousands. Odds were impossible and everyone knew it, but sometimes doing the right thing had nothing to do with odds. As the fleet traveled toward the Corvin border, Kevin walked through the corridors of his ship and talked with his crew. He found engineers working double shifts to make sure every system was ready for battle. He saw pilots running simulations over and over, trying to find any advantage they could use against the swarm. He watched medics preparing for casualties they all knew were coming in. The mess hall, he sat down with a group of young enlisted sailors who looked barely old enough to be out of school. One of them, a nervous kid named Tommy Price, who shared his last name but was no relation, asked the Admiral if he was scared. Kevin thought about the question for a moment and then said yes. He was terrified. Tommy seemed surprised that an admiral would admit to being afraid. Kevin explained that courage was not about not being scared. It was about being scared and doing the right thing anyway. Said, every single person on this ship was braver than any coward who sat safe at home and watched others suffer. Young sailors sat up a little straighter after hearing those words. Word spread through the ship and then through the whole fleet. Crew members who had been uncertain found their resolve hardening. They were going to do something the galaxy had deemed impossible. They were going to stand up and fight on. The final nights before they reached the Corvin border, Kevin stood alone on the observation deck and looked out at the stars. He thought about Earth and the billions of people who did not even know their fleet was about to go to war. He thought about all the lives that would be lost in the coming battle. He thought about whether he was making the right choice. Then he remembered the faces of the Corvin delegates at the summit, their desperate pleas for help. The way the other species had looked away rather than meet their eyes no matter what happened tomorrow. Kevin knew he could not have lived with himself if he had done the same. The stars seemed to shine a little brighter as the fleet drew closer to its destiny. Somewhere out there in the void, the swarm was waiting. They had consumed worlds and exterminated species without ever meeting real resistance. They were about to discover what happened when they pushed humanity too far. The Defiance and her sister ships were small and few, but they carried something the swarm had never encountered before. They carried the fire of a species that refused to let evil win without a fight. The Corvin homeworld of Desser hung in space like a dying ember, slowly fading into nothing. From orbit, Kevin could see the terrible scars where swarm bioships had already begun their harvest of the planet below. Great wounds had been carved into the surface where beautiful forests and thriving cities had stood. Just days before, millions of Corvin had already perished and millions more huddled in underground shelters waiting for a death that seemed certain. Marcus reported from the tactical station that they had detected the swarm fleet, and his voice was tight with barely controlled fear. He counted approximately 400 capital-class organisms, massive living ships, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built. Behind them swarmed thousands of smaller attack forms that moved through space like a plague of locusts. Kevin studied the tactical display and felt the weight of what they faced pressing down on him. Humanity had brought 37 ships to this fight, and they were about to face an enemy that outnumbered them more than 10 to 1. It was not enough, and it would never be enough, but they had come too far to turn back. Now Kevin ordered Laura to open a channel to the swarm. She hesitated and reminded him that the swarm had never responded to any attempt at communication in all the years they had been devouring worlds. They were not even sure the creatures could understand language at all. Kevin said he knew that, but he wanted them to hear this anyway. More importantly, he wanted the whole galaxy to hear what he was about to say. Laura opened the channel and began broadcasting on every frequency they had. reaching every ship and station and listening post within 100 light years. Kevin stood tall and began to speak. He announced himself as Admiral Kevin Price of the Earth Defense Fleet and said he was addressing the entity known as the Velthory Swarm. He told them they had invaded sovereign territory and killed millions of innocent people. They had been met with silence from those who should have stood against them, but that silence ended. Now Kevin looked at his crew, at the men and women who had chosen to stand beside him when the whole universe told them to run. He told the swarm that humanity did not abandon its friends. Humans did not calculate the odds of survival before deciding whether to fight for what was right. They were not a species that watched from the shadows while innocents burned. His hand closed into a fist as he delivered his final message. He said that if the swarm wanted to consume this galaxy, they would have to go through humanity first. Channel closed, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then the swarm fleet began to move, and thousands of biological vessels turned toward the human formation like a great beast that had scented blood. Kevin gave the order for all ships to open fire. The void of space erupted in flame and fury. Human vessels were smaller than the swarm bioships, but they were faster and more agile, and they were crewed by people fighting for something greater than survival. The Defiance carved through the enemy formation with its railguns tearing holes in the thick chitin armor of the creatures, while its point defense system shredded incoming organic projectiles. All around them, the battle raged in 3 dimensions as ships twisted and spun through the chaos. The cruiser Ardent found itself surrounded by enemy vessels 3 times its size, and its captain made a choice that would be remembered forever. Commander Jake Sullivan ordered his crew to the escape pods and then drove his ship straight into the heart of a swarm carrier. He detonated the reactor core at point blank range, and the explosion destroyed the carrier along with a dozen smaller bioships. Jake died so that others might live, and he was far from the last to make that sacrifice. On the other side of the battle, Commander Patricia Dunn led her destroyer squadron in a daring flanking maneuver that drew dozens of enemy vessels into a carefully prepared trap. Overlapping fields of fire from hidden weapon platforms toward the swarm ships apart before they could react, but still the enemy kept coming. For every bioship the humans destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The human fleet was being worn down ship by ship, and life by life. Kevin watched the casualty report scroll across his screen and felt each loss like a knife in his heart. These were his people dying out there in the cold void, and there was nothing he could do to save them. Laura suddenly called out that she was detecting new contacts entering the system, and Kevin felt his stomach drop. More swarm reinforcements would be the end of everything they had fought for. Asked how many, and prepared himself for the worst. Laura stared at her display for a long moment, and then her expression changed from fear to something like wonder. She said the new ships were not swarm at all. They were Corvanan. The tactical display, a new fleet appeared as Corvan warships emerged from faster than light travel and immediately began firing on the swarm from behind. Dozens of sleek vessels painted in the colors of the Corvan Navy tore into the enemy formation with weapons blazing. Laura announced they were receiving a transmission, and Kevin ordered her to put it through. The face of a Corvan commander appeared on screen with his scaled features twisted into an expression that Kevin had learned to recognize as fierce determination. The commander introduced himself and said his people had received the human broadcast. Their government had ordered them to retreat and save themselves while abandoning their homeworld to its fate. But then they had heard the words of Admiral Price, and they had remembered something important. He said that if humans could stand and fight for strangers, then the Corvan could find the courage to stand and fight for themselves. His crest rose in a gesture of deep respect as he declared that they would fight together. Kevin felt something loosen in his chest, a tightness that had been there since the Concorde had turned its back on the innocent. Smiled and welcomed the Corvan to the battle together. The combined fleet pressed forward, and for the first time since the war began, the unstoppable swarm began to falter The tide was turning, and though the cost had been terrible beyond measure, there was now hope where before there had been only despair. Word of what happened at Thesser spread across the stars faster than any ship could travel. The galaxy had watched humans throw themselves into impossible odds for people who were not even their own species. They had seen courage when everyone expected cowardice. They had witnessed sacrifice when everyone assumed humanity would choose survival. And deep in the hearts of beings across 1,000 worlds, something began to stir, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. Fire that humanity had brought to Thesser was beginning to spread. News of the Battle of Thesser spread across the galaxy like wildfire, and nothing would ever be the same again. The carefully maintained order of the Concord had been built on one simple assumption, that no species would ever risk itself for another. That assumption had just been proven wrong, and the cracks were starting to show on the agricultural world of Palaxis Prime. Young farmers who had never known war gathered around view screens and watched recordings of the battle. They saw human ships throwing themselves against impossible odds to protect people they had never met. They watched Defiance take hit after hit and keep fighting when any sane commander would have retreated. They heard Admiral Kevin Price deliver his message to the swarm, and they asked themselves what they would have done in his place on the Jirith homeworld. Military commanders who had voted against intervention found themselves facing angry questions from their own citizens. Why had they chosen to do nothing while innocents died? Why had they let the youngest species in the Concord shame them with courage that their own people seemed to have forgotten? The Jirith were a proud species who valued honor above almost everything else. Now they were being forced to admit that humans had shown more honor in one battle than the Jirith had demonstrated in centuries, and in the ancient stations of the Orvani, where beings who had lived for thousands of years drifted through halls of crystal and light, there was something new stirring. The Orvani had seen empires rise and fall so many times that they had stopped caring about the affairs of younger species. They had learned to watch and wait and never get involved, because involvement meant loss. But watching the humans fight had awakened memories that had been buried for ages. Memories of a time when the Orvani themselves had been young and foolish and brave. 3 weeks after the Battle of Thesser, Commander Patricia Dunn led a patrol along the edge of Concord's spacer ship. The Relentless had been hastily repaired after the battle, and her crew was exhausted beyond measure, but Patricia had volunteered for patrol duty anyway because someone had to keep watch on the borders. Her sensor officer suddenly reported multiple vessels approaching at high speed, and Patricia felt her heart begin to race. She asked if the contacts were swarm and prepared to sound battle stations. The sensor officer studied his readings for a moment and then said, "The ships were not swarm at all. Their configuration matched Jirith warships." Patricia watched in amazement as a fleet of elegant silver vessels dropped out of faster-than-light travel right in front of her battered little ship. At the head of the formation was the flagship of the Jirith Navy, a magnificent vessel that had not left its home system in over a century. The communications officer announced they were being hailed, and Patricia told him to put it through. The Jirith commander, who appeared on screen, was old by any standard, with crystalline features marked by patterns that indicated centuries of life. His name was Fleetmaster Valen, and when he spoke his voice carried harmonic undertones that Patricia had learned indicated deep sincerity among his kin. Valen said he had watched the recordings from Thesser over and over. He had seen human ships die for strangers, and it had forced him to examine everything he thought he knew about courage and honor. He told Patricia that he had served the Concord faithfully for 300 years. He had believed that peace meant avoiding conflict and that wisdom meant protecting yourself first. But Admiral Price had shown him something he had forgotten a long time ago. Patricia asked him what that was. Valen replied that peace without courage was just another word for cowardice. His form rippled in the Jirith equivalent of a deep bow as he declared that his fleet was now at humanity's disposal. Wherever the humans went, the Zirith would follow behind him. The silver ships of the Zirith Navy moved into formation alongside the battered, relentless. Patricia stared at the view screen for a long moment as tears began to form in her eyes. This was the first genuine smile she had managed since the war began as she welcomed Fleetmaster Valen to the fight. She said she knew exactly where they were needed. The combined human and Zirith force set course for the front lines, where the swarm was still pressing its attack on Corvan territory, but they were not the only ones who had been moved by what happened at Desser across the galaxy. Other species were having similar awakenings. The Palaxians were a peaceful species who had devoted themselves to agriculture for thousands of years. They had no real military to speak of, just a collection of massive farming ships that traveled between worlds bringing food to those in need. But the young farmers of Palaxis Prime demanded that their government do something to help. When the politicians hesitated, the farmers took matters into their own hands. They converted their great agricultural vessels into makeshift carriers, capable of launching small fighter craft. They loaded their ships with supplies and volunteers and set out for the war zone without waiting for permission. The Mandari were a species of traders and merchants who cared only about profit and had avoided violence for as long as anyone could remember. But even they could not ignore what humanity had done. Mandari cargo captains began offering their services free of charge to transport weapons and supplies to the front lines. Some of them armed their own ships and joined the fighting themselves. News reached Kevin Price at his temporary headquarters aboard the Defiance, which was still undergoing repairs from the battle. Every day brought reports of more species sending ships and volunteers to help. The trickle had become a stream, and the stream was becoming a flood. Laura came to his quarters one evening with the latest intelligence reports and found him staring out the viewport at the stars. She asked if he was all right, and he turned to look at her with an expression she could not quite read. Kevin said he had never expected any of this to happen. He had gone to Desser believing he was leading his people to a noble death. He had thought the best they could hope for was to buy the Corvan a little more time before the swarm overwhelmed everyone. But something had changed, and he was not sure he understood what it was. Laura smiled and said she thought she did understand. She told him that humans had done something nobody else was willing to do. They had shown the galaxy that there were things worth dying for, and now that the other species had seen that courage, they were remembering that they possessed it too. Kevin nodded slowly as her words sank in. Maybe that was what humanity had always been meant to do, not to save the galaxy by themselves, but to remind everyone else that they could save it together. The fire they had lit at Desser was spreading, and there was no telling how far it might reach. The swarm had never encountered anything like this before in all its millions of years of existence. They had consumed their way across the cosmos since before most current species had even evolved. Every civilization they encountered responded in the same predictable ways. Some fought briefly before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. Others fled and abandoned their neighbors, hoping to buy themselves more time. A few desperate souls tried to negotiate and offered up sacrifices of their own worlds in exchange for temporary peace. But humans did something completely different. Humans fought and kept fighting long past the point where they should have been destroyed, and somehow they convinced others to fight alongside them. Admiral Kevin Price stood in the war room of the newly established Allied Command, a facility that had been hastily constructed in orbit above Earth. Around the holographic table stood representatives of species that had never worked together. The four Corvan tacticians, with their scaled faces, studied battle data alongside Zirith strategists whose crystalline forms shimmered in the artificial light. Palaxian agricultural experts who had never imagined becoming warriors collaborated with human weapon specialists on new tactics. Even a delegation from the ancient Orvani had arrived. Beings who moved slowly but whose minds worked faster than anyone could imagine. The Ovani had not involved themselves in the affairs of younger species for 10,000 years. Their presence here showed just how much the galaxy had changed Corvin. General Thiessen pointed at the holographic display and announced that the swarm was adapting to face this new threat. They had learned that their traditional tactics did not work against coordinated resistance from multiple species intelligence. Suggested they were gathering their forces for a single massive strike designed to break the alliance in one blow. Kevin asked where the attack would come. Thiessen's clawed hand manipulated the display and zoomed in on a region of space that made Kevin's blood run cold. The target was the Sol system. The target was Earth. Everyone in the room fell silent as they understood what this meant. Swarm had decided that the key to victory was destroying the heart of the resistance if they could kill the humans. Then the alliance would collapse and the other species would scatter back to their own corners of the galaxy. Kevin asked how long they had to prepare. Thiessen replied that they had 6 days. Perhaps less. Kevin looked around the room at the faces of beings from a dozen different worlds. Just 3 months ago, none of them would have risked anything for Earth. Now they were here, ready to put their lives on the line for a planet that was not their own. He told them they had 6 days to prepare the warmest welcome the swarm had ever received, and then ordered everyone to get to work. The preparations that followed were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Human shipyards ran around the clock with workers pushing themselves to exhaustion and then pushing even harder. Zereth fabrication vessels arrived and began producing weapons and armor at speeds that amazed the human engineers. Corvan construction ships worked alongside human crews to build defense platforms and minefields. Throughout the solar system, the Palaxians contributed their expertise in ways nobody had expected. Their massive farming ships were converted into carriers capable of launching entire squadrons of fighter craft. They brought supplies and food to keep the defenders fed during the battle ahead. Ovani opened their ancient archives for the first time in millennia and shared knowledge of technologies that had been thought lost forever. Weapons systems that could tear through swarm biome, or like paper shield generators that could protect entire fleets. Engine designs that made human ships faster and more maneuverable than ever before. But it was the smaller contributions that mattered most. To Kevin, civilian vessels from across the Concord arrived carrying volunteers who wanted to help however they could. Medical ships staffed by doctors who had never treated human patients before, but were determined to learn. Supply freighters loaded with food and materials donated by worlds that could barely spare them. Even a delegation of Velthari arrived, a splinter faction that had broken away from the swarm generations ago. They offered to share everything they knew about their former hive's weaknesses in exchange for nothing but the chance to see the swarm defeated. On the 5th day, Kevin received a message from Margaret Gray at the Concord station. Her voice was thick with emotion as she delivered the news. The full council had voted, and for the first time in 10,000 years, they had authorized military action. The entire Concord fleet was being mobilized to defend Earth. Every species that had once refused to help was now sending everything they had. Kevin closed his eyes and let the weight of those words sink into his soul. When he opened them, he saw Laura standing in the doorway watching him with tears streaming down her face. She whispered that they had done it, and that they had actually done it. Kevin shook his head slowly and reminded her they had not done anything yet. The battle had not even begun, and there was no guarantee they would survive what was coming. But he was smiling as he spoke, because for the first time since this all began, he truly believed they had a chance. Fleet that gathered around Earth in those final hours was a testament to what could be accomplished. When people chose hope over fear, ships of every design and origin took up position around the small blue world that had started this revolution. Human dreadnoughts bristling with weapons stood ready alongside elegant Zereth battlecruisers. Corv carriers prepared to launch their fighters, while Palaxim converted freighters held position near Bjorvani. Vessels that had been dormant for millennia hummed with ancient power as their crews ran final checks, and at the center of it all, the Defiance waited with her hull still bearing the scars of the battle that had changed everything. Kevin walked through his ship one last time and talked with his crew. He shook hands with engineers and embraced old friends. He told them all how proud he was of everything they had accomplished. Tomorrow, they would face the greatest battle in human history. Tomorrow, they would discover whether courage was enough to overcome impossible odds. Tomorrow, they would speak in fire once more, and this time, the whole galaxy would be speaking with them. The swarm arrived on the 6th day, and they darkened the stars with their numbers. From his position on the bridge of the Defiance, Kevin watched the enemy fleet emerge from faster-than-light travel in wave after wave that seemed to have no end. There were thousands of them. More bioships gathered in one place than ever been seen before. The largest vessels were the size of moons with cavernous mouths, capable of swallowing entire planets whole. Behind them came millions of smaller attack forms that moved through the void like a plague, given physical shape. But waiting for them was something the swarm had never faced in all their millions of years of consuming worlds. Combined fleet of every species in the Concord hung in space around the edge of the Sol system, forming a wall of metal and energy and determination. Human dreadnoughts stood shoulder to shoulder with Zirith battlecruisers whose silver hulls gleamed in the distant sunlight. Corvan carriers deployed their fighters alongside Palaxian converted freighters crewed by farmers who had become warriors. Ovani vessels reactivated after millennia of slumber hummed with weapons that had won wars before humanity's ancestors had climbed down from the trees. And at the heart of it all, Earth hung blue and green and beautiful in the void. This was the world that had produced a species crazy enough to stand against the darkness when everyone else had chosen to look away. This was what they were fighting for. Laura announced that all fleets were reporting ready and awaiting orders. Kevin looked at the tactical display one final time and studied the impossible odds they faced. Even with the full might of the Concord behind them, the swarm still outnumbered the defenders. There was no guarantee of victory, and every person in the fleet knew that many of them would not survive this day, but they had something the swarm would never understand. They had each other. Kevin ordered Lara to open a channel on all frequencies so that every ship in the fleet could hear his voice. He began to speak, and his words carried across 1,000,000 kilometers of space to reach the ears of warriors from 100 different worlds. He said that 3 months ago, humanity had stood alone against an enemy that should have destroyed them. They had fought because they believed some things were worth dying for, believed that courage mattered, and that no one should have to face the darkness without someone standing beside them. Today, they were not alone anymore. Today, every species in the galaxy stood united against an enemy that had thought fear would keep them divided. Swarm had believed that terror would make them abandon each other. They had been wrong. Kevin's voice rose as he continued speaking. To the fleet, he said the galaxy had turned its back on humanity once, and others had stayed silent while innocent people died. But humanity had spoken, and they had spoken in fire. They had spoken so loudly that the universe itself had no choice but to listen. Today, they would speak again. Today, they would tell the swarm that this galaxy belonged to those who had the courage to defend it. Today, they would tell these monsters that their endless hunger ended here. He gave the order for all ships to attack. The battle that followed would be recorded in the histories of every civilization that survived to write them down. Some called it the Fire of Soul, while others named it the Great Stam. Many simply called it the day we remembered who we were. Swarm fought with all the ferocity of a species that had never known defeat. Their bioships crashed against the Allied lines, like waves breaking against a cliff, and for every enemy destroyed, they seemed to spawn 2 more. But the Alliance held firm. Hyrith vessels executed maneuvers of crystalline precision as their silver hulls danced through enemy formations with deadly Grace Corvan warriors, threw themselves into boarding actions, and their battle cries echoed through the organic corridors of captured swarm carriers, Spelexian captains who had been farmers. Just months ago rammed their ships into the gaping mouths of planet eaters and detonated their reactors to take the monsters with them, and the humans refused to give up as they always had throughout their history. The Defiance was hit 17 times during the battle. Her engines failed, and her weapon systems burned out one by one. Hull was breached in a dozen places, and fires raged through her lower decks, but Kevin ordered repairs and kept fighting, and his crew followed him because they had come too far to stop now in the final hour of the battle. The Swarm's queen ship emerged from the heart of their fleet. She was vast beyond imagination, a living vessel that contained the intelligence guiding the entire hive. As long as she survived, the Swarm would keep coming no matter how many of them were destroyed. It was the Defiance that led the charge against her, battered and burning and held together by nothing but willpower and desperate repairs. The human flagship drove straight toward the Queen. Every ship in the fleet provided cover fire as Kevin pushed his vessel past its limits. The Defiance plunged into the Queen's massive form and delivered a killing blow that tore through her central nervous system. When the Queen died, the Swarm died with her. Without her guiding intelligence, the remaining bioships fell into chaos and began turning on each other in mindless fury. Within hours, the threat that had consumed worlds for millions of years was reduced to scattered remnants fleeing into the void. The war was over. In the aftermath, as the galaxy began to rebuild, representatives from every Concord species gathered on Earth. They came to sign a new treaty that would bind them not through cold calculation, but through genuine friendship. They came to honor the fallen and celebrate the living, but mostly they came to thank the species that had reminded them what it meant to be truly civilized. Kevin Price, now promoted to Fleet Admiral and named the first human to serve on the Concord's Supreme Council, stood before the assembled delegates. He was tired and still healing from wounds he had suffered in the battle. He had never been comfortable with speeches, but some things needed to be said. He admitted that 3 months ago he had been angry at all of them. He had thought they were cowards who had forgotten what it meant to stand for something greater than themselves. He had been wrong. They had not forgotten at all. They had just been waiting for someone to remind them. He looked out at the faces of beings from 100 different worlds, now united in a way that had once seemed impossible. He said that humanity was not the strongest species or the wisest or the oldest, but humans were stubborn and idealistic. They believed against all evidence that the universe could be better than it was, and apparently that kind of belief was contagious. Laughter spread through the great hall, followed by applause that grew into cheering. In orbit above Earth, the Defiance hung in the void, with her hull scarred by battle and marked by the flags of every species that had fought alongside her. She would need years of repair before she could fly again, but she would fly, and when she did, she would never fly alone. The galaxy had learned something important in those desperate months of war. They had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite. They had learned that unity was not weakness, but strength beyond measure, and they had learned that when the darkness came and the silence fell, there would always be someone willing to speak, someone willing to speak in fire. The end.